Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, although I wasn't so thrilled when I looked at the weather forecast. I grew up in western New York State, where either you were getting lake effect snow from Lake Erie or Lake Ontario, and these kinds of temperatures were not unusual. But I've been in Denver for 24 years and have softened, and was thinking yesterday, why the heck did I say yes to Mark for a meeting in Wisconsin in the middle of January? But in any case, I am pleased to be here. And I should throw out the caveat to start with that I do work for Leprino Foods. I've been with Leprino for 24 years. So obviously that experience informs my perspective, but I'm not speaking on behalf of Leprino Foods. We have not collaborated internally. These are my thoughts. But to get started, let me give you a little bit of perspective on Leprino. We are the world's largest mozzarella manufacturer. We tend to fly a little bit under the radar because we don't sell anything at retail under our own label. But within the U.S., we sell all of the cheese that Pizza Hut, Domino's, Papa John's use, as well as a number of the other chains. We sell a lot of mozzarella into the food manufacturers who do frozen entrees and the like. And a fair amount of our cheese does go into retail, but through the private label folks or the branded folks, whether it's a Kraft or a Sargento or Great Lakes or Schreiber or Masters Gallery that do a lot of the store brands. We also produce a lot of whey products. I say we don't do anything at the straight retail level. We have developed a sports nutrition label. We're starting to harvest whey proteins without cheese making in our newest expansion in Greeley, Colorado. And so there's a brand called Ascent that mostly is going through the gyms, but you can find it in Whole Foods now and a few other segments. That's our first foray directly into retail. But my industry experience really started out most informed by growing up on a dairy farm in western New York. Taught high school agriculture after my bachelor's, and after my master's was a farm credit loan officer in the mid-'80s before shifting over to the processing side of the industry, where I had a great opportunity when Mark was, I think, working on his PhD at Cornell to get acquainted, and have enjoyed that collaboration over many years. But Leprino Foods, as far as our footprint, our global footprint, we have 9 plants in the U.S., and our intent has always been to produce in the U.S. and export. But we also have global ambitions. Many of those customers I already listed have global footprints. They asked us to expand into Europe in the 80s. They wanted us to supply them there, but the trade barriers were significant enough that we could not do that from the U.S. So we entered into a joint venture with Glanbia, which you know of as an American cheese company producing a lot of cheddar here in the U.S., mostly Idaho, New Mexico, about to build a large plant in Michigan. But they're our partner producing mozzarella cheese in the U.K. with the intent to supply the EU market, which Brexit is now bringing into question. But in any case, that explains our UK investment. We also have production assets in Brazil, which we entered into a joint venture more recently. That was a few years ago. And that's also mostly because of the trade barriers. We look at Brazil as the second largest mozzarella market in the world. And in order to access that, we needed to produce there. The other locations that are up there, you see our 9 plants across the country, none of which are in Wisconsin. But I do have an appreciation for Wisconsin, particularly with the parallels with western New York, where I grew up, a lot of similarities. But the other locations, Singapore, we have a business hub specifically built out to support our exports from the U.S. So we have business managers, we have innovation staff, both on the product development side as well as chefs helping our Asian customers create food ideas for menus that are culturally relevant and intriguing. Sales staff, technical staff in Singapore, but we also found that, even though from the U.S. perspective it seems like we're well positioned with that Singapore hub, it's still an 8-hour flight to China. So now we do have sales staff in China, in Japan, and in Korea. I want to talk a little bit about the consolidation on the manufacturing side, before I talk a little bit about the intersection of the farm side consolidation with the manufacturing side to kind of close things out, if you look at the manufacturing side trends, they're very similar to the farm side trends in terms of this is just the cheese plant numbers based on NAS data versus the annual cheese production per plant. And you'll see that in 1960, you had about 1,400 cheese plants. We've lost 72% of them to have about 400 plants in the U.S. at this point. And on the production per plant, we've gone from about 1 million pounds of cheese per year, which, in rough terms, I estimate it's about 300,000 pounds of milk per day processed at standard yields, up to about 20.5 million pounds of cheese, 600,000 pounds of milk per day, which actually surprised me. The average cheese plant size was that small, but it's a 20-fold increase in terms of the size. The economies of scale are very important, particularly in the commodity cheese sector, where it's less differentiated product, very stiff competition, very low margins, so cheddar, standard mozzarella, a lot of those plants. It's very difficult to compete in those commodities if you don't have the scale and a customer base that allows you to produce essentially a same spec product for full days at that scale. When I joined Leprino in the mid-'90s, most of the large-scale plants were largely located in California. A few larger plants were starting to develop in Idaho, but for the most part, it was a West Coast phenomenon. If you look at the large plant phenomena today, you'll see many plants that are much further east, including, of course, the Hilmar plant processing 14 million pounds of milk a day in Delhart, Texas. You have the plant in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Land O'Lakes plant that I think has the capacity to process about 6 million pounds of milk a day into the powder side, butter powder side. New plant going in Michigan from Glambia, which is going to be very large as well. So that phenomena has shifted across the country as dairies have gotten larger across the country. And to me, part of the explanation on that is, again, if you're in that commodity cheese space, the margins are thin enough that you're not going to be able to collect milk from great distances and make it cash flow. But as farms and milk production has become more dense, if your objective, as ours is to procure milk from within a 50-mile radius of your plant, the milk that's being produced within 50 miles is much larger, facilitating a larger cheese plant. But what I find interesting is when you update that time frame to the period since 2000, and this is NAS data, and I haven't delved into further data relative to the development of artisan cheese plants and the like, but I can only conjecture that when you look at this trend, cheese plants, the number of cheese plants actually bottomed out in 1999. And since that period, they've added about 160 cheese plants. I can only conjecture that that is in part the opportunity that's been developed as consumers have further segmented into any number of niches, whether it's folks who value local and you can build a little cheese plant and go to the farm market, or some of the pasture-based or some other specialty cheese opportunities that probably are not really adaptable to these very large plants. So what I see is this market segmentation that's happening both on the processing side, but really being facilitated by what's happening on the consumer side with these, whether it's pasture-based, organic, a number of different things. So the interesting piece on around 2000, the average production per cheese plant was just over 20 million pounds per year, And in 2017, the last data that NAS released was just over 22 million pounds, so much flatter in that period. And again, 40% increase in plant numbers from about 400 up to 563 in that same time period. Now, if you look at overall company size as opposed to plant size, what you see again is that evolution toward more large companies. And this graphic was put together based on data released by Rabobank, large not only lender for agriculture worldwide, but also they have a great deal of capacity on the research side. But I'm not going to go through all of these companies, but just visually you can see that migration. In the left column is their estimate of sales in 2000 by the top 20 dairy companies worldwide. And you'll see Nestle was up there above $13 billion. These are US dollar equivalents. But for the most part, the companies that are in there are less than that $8 billion mark. And with each segment, the next one is 2005, you see a migration upward in the graph. And then the final column is 2015, again, a migration upward as those companies have consolidated. You know, at this point, the largest dairy company in the world is Nestle at about $24 billion. Lactalis, a French-owned company with a fair amount of ownership in the U.S., but also around the world, is just shy of $20 billion. DFA is number 4 at about $15 billion. There are a few places or a few companies that have shifted position if you look at the 2017 data since then. So Friesland Campina has moved up into the next segment. You have Mengniu, a Chinese company that has also moved up, and DMK, a German company that has moved up. A lot of continued consolidation. Much of this has been through acquisitions. And you know, this is also a little bit of an eye chart, and it's honestly outdated, but it gives you that sense of the acquisitions that have happened over time. I think this might even be already 5 years old, so a lot of the companies that have been acquired by these companies have already, or are not on here, but again, DFA, upper left, about 15 billion pounds in the most recent year, number 4 in the world. Saputo in the upper right, those folks here probably are quite acquainted with Saputo because of their Wisconsin acquisitions, but number 8 in the world now, about $11 billion. Fonterra, the New Zealand powerhouse, number 5 in the world, about $14 billion. Lactalis is number 2 behind Nestle, almost $20 billion. And then you have Friesland Campina in the lower left, which started out as a Dutch cooperative, but again, they've been quite aggressive with acquisitions over the years. They're number 6 with about $16 billion. And then you have another co-op, Arla, which at that point, actually, now as I think about it, I think Arla is combined. They're no longer separate, but well, actually, no. I have my note, number 7 at about $12 billion. But the point is there's a lot of consolidation that's happened in the dairy space. So what are the implications? From a milk marketing procurement structure perspective, I'm not sure that there's one model that fits all. There are some processors who will look at the consolidation at the farm level and say, hey, that's an opportunity for me to bypass the co-op. In the last data I saw, about 85% of the milk in the U.S. was controlled by co-ops. So perhaps these larger dairies would be a very efficient way to have a direct supply arrangement without the co-op in the middle. You see folks like Hilmar Cheese, which, by the way, was founded by dairy farmers in California who thought that they had the potential of getting higher in the value chain, capturing that revenue. but they did not form a co-op. But they're very comfortable with the model of going out to the individual dairymen, and they work with a lot of very large dairymen. My company's perspective on that is we spend a lot of money on a plant, anywhere, depending upon the plant, probably $600 million to $1 billion these days. We cannot afford to have that plant run inefficiently. If we contract with a co-op, it's much more comfortable for us to have confidence we're going to be able to run that plant efficiently over the long term. Whereas going with a large producer, let's say they're so large that they supply a quarter of the plant, that would add risk to us. Let's say we don't reach agreement on price at a particular point in time, then we'd be running very inefficiently, but even more importantly, probably unable to supply some of our customers. And so, again, this consolidation at the farm level, I don't think necessarily weakens the co-op position in the supply chain. But there will be some companies who look at it as an opportunity to go directly. Relative to the market specialization to address the segmentation, I think that it does create some greater opportunities to coordinate the supply chain to address some of those consumer niches, and probably some of them are more than niches at this point. And I'll use an example of Danone, the French company that's the parent of Danone, but also many other brands. Danone itself is not going GMO-free, including feed, as I understand it, across all of their SKUs, all of their product line. But there are some pieces within their product line that they want to be able to claim that the milk was produced from cows that there was no GMO association, including not even eating GMO feed, which is one step beyond what even the Europeans are doing. The Europeans allow GMO feed generally. But in any case, Danone, over the last several years, has started to develop relationships, some directly, but some also with co-op members, where they're establishing cost-plus contracts with dairymen who are willing to produce according to Danone's regimen, which includes the GMO-free feed. And I think that you can see it's not just the scale. In the case of Danone, I think they have enough demand that they tend to focus a little bit on larger farms, but you can also see on a small-scale basis as new products are developed that want to make some of these claims that give the manufacturer social license or whatever you want to call it, you will see more of that coordinated supply chain piece, and that creates an opportunity, again, both for the large guys and potentially for also some of the small guys. The other thing that this consolidation makes me think about is whether over the long term there's more opportunity to develop essentially three primary channels. I'll put it into three buckets for the dairy industry. One would be what I have up here is undifferentiated, but that would be milk that is produced conventionally by good management practices, and the target market is those consumers who have confidence in sound science and good management practices and animal care that I am convinced that dairymen around the country deploy. And so you have, that's what I would think of today as the conventional market. And then there will be a segment of demand for processors who are marketing to those consumers who want something special, whether it's the pasture-fed, GMO-free, cow got pet 5 times a day, including at midnight. Whatever the consumer preference is, I see that as an additional segment that increasingly will play a role, just given the millennial trends. And then the other question that came up recently at a meeting that Mark and I were both at relative to, what's the moonshot on genetic research and, the direction of the industry. Is there a segment that moves toward pharmaceutical applications where Maybe there's transgenic work and the milk does not enter the mainstream supply chain. It's produced for pharmaceutical purposes. And back before I joined Leprino in the early 90s, I had a consulting business, and at that point one of my clients was a pharmaceutical company that did infant formula. And even back in the early 90s, there apparently was a bull named Oscar or something in Germany that apparently had been developed by one of the pharmaceutical companies to, develop milk that, again, was specialized for a protein that more closely emulates human milk. Apparently he was also sterile, so it didn't really work out so well. But in any case, science continues to progress, and maybe that's also a market segment over the long term. Finally, question on ownership models. Over my whole career, people have asked me about vertical integration in dairy, and I said I really didn't see a lot of vertical integration appetite from processors to get into dairy farming. But what I am seeing is increasingly vertical integration appetite from the farm level up, and I think that we will see some of that, particularly as some of these folks who have been able to amass significant resources, whether it's internal or external, whether it's a number of dairymen going together or whether it's investment capital, folks who want to control their own destiny and vertically integrate.